Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 7 game from the New York International. Now, if you followed the round 6 video, you know that I won a game against an untitled player with black and finally started to get back on the right track because I'd played several games that weren't very clean, and at least I showed that some technique in the last game. So in this one, I was hoping to, continue that momentum and that continuity and, hopefully get another W. Now, one thing that was kind of funny is that I actually expected to have the white pieces because I had black in the previous round. But unfortunately, I was actually paired with black again. So I actually had double black, which is not ideally what you want. White does constitute an opening advantage most of the time. It's almost like having the first serve in tennis. So it was not, I was not pleased when I learned that I would be playing black again, but it happens sometimes. Sometimes you get double white, sometimes you get double black. It is what it is. My opponent in this one was an untitled player by the name of Robert Perez. And this name was actually familiar to me because he's very close in age to me. I believe he was born in 95, so I'm 2 years older than him. And he's actually been on the scene for a while and is not just any old untitled player because his FIDE rating is nearly 2,400. It's somewhere like 2,350, 2,360 at the time of this game. And essentially, he just, didn't pay for the FM title, I suppose, and really didn't want to have any title next to his name besides IM. But if I had to reckon a guess, he must have at least a few IM norms having a FIDE rating so close to 2,400. And it's always funny when you see an untitled player with a really high rating because, it's just not something you see every day. In fact, there aren't many Grandmasters in history that actually were actually over 2,500 before they actually got the title. I can recall, of course there's more nowadays, but I can recall way back when Vladimir Kramnik was one of these guys that had a FIDE rating of like 2,600, but no GM title. And it's kind of like a joke at that point. It's like, come on, give this guy the title. So anyways, I was, hoping to kind of put some pressure on him. Nonetheless, I am a rating favorite and see what happens. So let's get into it. So I opened with D4, and I played D5, and then C4, E6, Knight F3, and A6. I decided to go for my pet line with this A6 line and the Queen's Gambit decline, which kind of forces White to make a decision about the C4 pawn. As I've discussed in the past, the threat for Black is actually to play D takes C4 and reinforce that pawn with B5. And, so if you don't want to make it a true gambit, White needs to decide to protect that pawn on C4 or actually capture on D5. And most people wind up capturing on D5 because after C takes D5, E takes D5, and Knight C3, White actually has is essentially a tempo up, so to speak, on normal Queen's Gambit exchange variation lines because this A6 move was not developing a piece. Now, White players will argue that this is a significant advantage. The black player, in particular, I would argue that this A6 move is actually quite useful because it actually is good prophylaxis against an impending minority attack with B4, B5. And so A6 is not as bad as it looks. And, if Black actually completes his development, this move, won't stick out like a sore thumb. The other thing in the system is normally in Queen's Gambit exchange variation lines, the most venomous position for the knight on the king's side is actually on E2 and not on F3. So in this move order, the knight's already on F3, so the most common plan in these Queen's Gambit exchange variation lines is often the Botvinnik plan, where you play F3 and prepare E4 with the knight on E2. And given that that's not really a possibility here, Black has actually kind of dodged the most venomous line of the Queen's Gambit exchange variation. Although Knight F3 also has its merits, and Karpov essentially played Knight F3 religiously in the Queen's Gambit exchange, whereas Kasparov actually put his knight always on E2. So it's actually kind of funny. You could just see from the styles, which move is going to which person. So Kasparov was super, super aggressive. He wanted to, push forward in the center, whereas Karpov is super positional. He was keen to put the knight on F3 and then go for a minority attack. So, yeah, just a contrast of styles. but they're both effective. And I'll say this, both players actually scored 90% in the particular Queen's Gambit exchange line they preferred. So just go to show you there's many ways to skin a cat. So anyways, after knight c3, I went knight f6, now trying to develop my pieces. And after bishop g5, I went bishop e6. And this is actually the nuance in this system with a6, is black actually tries to put the bishop on e6 instead of keeping it on c8 to defend the d5 pawn, and then puts the knight on d7. And the idea is that now this bishop on e6 is actually doing a job where usually it sits on c8 for a really long time. So in this particular line, the bishops tend to go to e6 and d6 actually. So anyways, bishop e6, e3, knight bd7. You can see now everything is really tidy and protected on d5. And after bishop d3, bishop d6. And now you can see this a6 move being kind of useful, because if the pawn wasn't on a6, knight b5 would be a later annoyance to harass this bishop on d6. So now that's not a possibility. And after castles, white played h3. This move is actually quite typical in these lines, because you actually want to not allow bishop g4 later in the game, because that pin can be kind of annoying. And h3 is especially important in conjunction with white's next move, because I went h6 challenging this bishop on g5, and now white actually went bishop f4. And this has actually been played 5 or 6 times by my check in the database, but it's actually a well-known idea in this variation. And the idea is that taking on f4 is kind of undesirable, because if you take on f4 after e takes f4, even though white has these double pawns, he has a massive outpost on e5 for his knight, and immediately actually f5 threatens to trap the bishop on e6. And now you can see why this h3 move was super important, because if the pawn was on h2, I would have bishop g4, which would be a huge difference. So actually, for instance, I actually had someone against me once play bishop f4 right away, and I actually took on f4 and then went bishop g4, and I got a massive positional edge, because now I'm actually stopping the knight from getting to e5. And if the knight doesn't land on e5, then white actually is just worse, because he does have a pawn minority on the queen side. And, making use of these double pawns without, having that outpost is pretty important. Also, keep in mind, this knight on c3 is never getting to e5, because it takes 4 moves to get there, right? 2 diagonals away. So it's very important that the knight on f3 can get to e5. So that's pretty much why h3 was played. So after h6, bishop f4, I don't really want to take on f4, so because of that, I need to keep the tension, and the most effective way to do that is to play queen e7. The point is that you put the queen here, and you connect your rooks, and you say that I'm comfortable trading on d6 if it's with my queen, because c takes d6 would be kind of an ugly move to make, so you don't want to take with the c pawn. So anyways, after queen e7, white went rook c1. This makes some sense now, playing along the c file. Typically in these structures, there are 2 plans for white. One is to go for a minority attack with rook b1 and b4, and another one is to play along the c file with knight a4, knight a4 and knight c5. Because this square is a little bit sensitive, given the fact that b7 would be loose, the e6 bishop would be under fire. So those are kind of the maneuvers I need to look out for. After rook c1, I went rook fe8. This is typically a really good waiting move in these structures. The point is that at some juncture, there is the possibility that I might take on f4 and go knight e4. So the point is that if I play rook e8, it's kind of like a useful waiting move, getting the rook to a half-open file. And there are some positions where knight e4 might be a possibility, and then my rook is well placed tactically to sort of indirectly defend the potential pawn that would land on e4. So after rook e8, white went queen c2. Makes sense, trying to connect his own rooks, and also getting the queen on the c file. Again, the c pawn is going to be a little bit sensitive if I just leave it on c7 in conjunction with this knight a4 idea I talked about. I now went rook fc8 just to give added cover to that that c pawn, and I also wanted to kind of wait on white to kind of show me what they were trying to do. Because in a lot of these structures, you don't want to necessarily rush with a plan until white sort of tells you what their plan is, because white has so many interesting ideas. So again, I said knight a4, b4 is one. There's also knight e2, and then after bishop takes d6, knight f4, like that, which is another plan. And so basically, I'm just kind of waiting patiently just for white to kind of show me what they're trying to do. Funnily enough, now white actually played rook fd1. And I think, my opponent actually had the same idea of kind of shuffling and, basically not committing to anything really crazy until I actually showed him what I was trying to do. And we were both playing this waiting game, essentially, to, essentially, figure out what the opponent's trying to do and then react. The funny thing here is that I was thinking about, ways I could play really more actively and not play the waiting game, but they all revolve around my pawn break c5. And the issue with the c5 move is that I actually give myself an isolated pawn. So I'm actually well aware that that black is, okay in these positions after c5, but in practice, playing with the isolated pawn can be a little bit annoying, and because white hasn't actually started with the minority attack, he doesn't have these weak squares on the c file like he normally would if he'd pushed the b pawn already. So the point is that, actually going for c5 with the pawn on b2 is a little bit positionally risky because the knight is well protected on c3 and it's hard to really get super active. So given that fact, I was really trying to kind of bide my time and be a little bit more patient with the c5 break. And that's why in this position I actually went c6. And my point is that I'm just going to wait and not really play c5 and kind of just invite white to essentially go for a minority attack, but just to keep my structure solid again until white commits to something. But now white went a3, and I really was kind of stuck because I wasn't sure what I should be doing. A3 is actually a pretty useful move because it covers the b4 square in some lines, and white can still actually change course and go b4 and knight a4, knight c5. And the knight getting to a4 and then to c5 would be extremely unpleasant. Let's say that I just shuffle my pieces, and let's say I go like king h8, for instance. If king h8, b4... Or no, not b4. b4 is actually a positional mistake because after b5, now the knight actually can't get to c5 anymore. So it's actually very important to start with knight a4. But let's say I go king g8 and now b4, king h8, and knight c5. And this is the type of position that becomes extremely unpleasant because you could see b7 is, kind of tricky to defend. I could defend it passively with rook b8, but that's not nice. And then this knight is also eyeing the e6 bishop, that he may decide to take at any given moment. And now that the knight's on c5, a4 and b5 are interesting plans to kind of, execute the minority attack. So the point is that with this a3 move, I thought he was kind of revving up for knight a4, and I was like, I don't know if I want to tolerate that. So I actually decided to play the very radical b5. And the point with b5 was actually just to stop this maneuver, knight a4 and knight c5. But it's also extremely committal because you can see now that I have this backward c pawn, white actually has a target to work with. So frankly, as soon as I played b5, I actually understood that it was quite likely that I was going to have to follow up with c5 to liberate that backward pawn. And the reason I can't just keep this pawn on c6 is, again, because white can actually just go knight e2 and then start to hammer away at the c6 pawn. Now, in structures where the pawn would be on b4, then I don't have to push the c pawn. I can actually play knight b6 and knight c4. So, for instance, let's say b4 is played. It was not, but let's say it was played. Now knight b6 is actually extremely effective because I can put that knight on c4 and cover my backward c pawn. And, black actually has a very satisfactory position here. But because he hasn't pushed that b pawn, that's the difference. He can always challenge the knight on c4 with an eventual b3. And that's the key difference. So anyways, after b5, white actually did play knight e2, and this is actually really, really smart because he's already eyeing this weakness. And at any moment now, he could take on d6 as well and reposition this knight on f4. So you might say, well, what if you try knight b6, knight c4 now? Well, the issue with knight b6 now is that after bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, white, has many, many decent options, but one that appeals to me is actually just queen c5. And the point is, provoking this kind of queen trade, I think, would be kind of unpleasant. Note that after queen takes c5, rook takes c5. Actually, this isn't so bad because I can go knight a4 or knight c4. So maybe it's actually not best to occupy the square. But in any case, this knight is not a permanent fixture on c4. That's basically my point, is that, let's say knight f4 is played and now knight c4. Obviously, b3 doesn't work right away because a3 is hanging, but white can slow play it. White can go bishop f1 and knight d3 and maybe knight c5. And eventually, my knight on c4 will be evicted with b3 at some point. So that's kind of the point and the reason I didn't really want to go for knight b6. So after knight e2, I kind of decided, you know what, I'm going to actually go for c5 and, play the position as actively as possible with the Isolani because I figured that I wouldn't be able to hold this forever. And after c5, d takes c5 was played and knight takes c5. And this is always the thing that's kind of risky about this position now is black is super active all over the queen side, but this d-pawn is isolated. So mentally, you have to kind of get into that mode of playing with the isolated pawn and being comfortable with it. And I'd seen this position at home, like in my analysis, so I knew that this was a scenario that I had to be able to defend properly. But it is a little bit frustrating because it's difficult to really seriously get any winning chances with such a poor structure. So anyways, after knight takes c5, white played bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, and knight f4. And this move is actually quite good because, you might say, oh, this queen on c2 is in the line of fire of the rook. Well, the issue is I don't have any decisive discoveries. So it's actually quite useful to put the knight here and then, move the queen wherever you want later because I have no, problematic discoveries for white. So, I do need to try and get active somehow. So I actually went bishop d7. And my point is I was just going to keep the tension on the c file, just another move, just to see what white was doing. And I also wanted to preserve my bishop because I didn't like scenarios where knight takes e6 was an option. So I just decided, I'm going to keep this bishop and defend the position like this. I also could have played a move like knight ce4 right away. And the point is the queen moves to e2, and I can go knight c5 back and try to hold the position like this. But you can see that at the very least there's a potential repetition, and I didn't want to draw here. So that kind of was ruled out automatically. Another option in this position is actually knight takes d3. And after queen takes d3, the position is actually still kind of unpleasant for black because this knight can just sit on d4 and white has really good control of the dark squares. And so, I might be able to hold this, but it's just kind of unpleasant. This is why I rejected this. Another move is actually, after knight f4, I could play a move like, I don't know. I could maybe play like rook c7 or rook c8 or something like that and prepare to double. But actually I decided to play bishop d7. So just keeping my options open, if you will. Now white went queen b1, stepping the queen out of the fire of the rook on c8. And it's also quite a decent move because it protects b2 and it also entertains exchanges on the c-file. White would be extremely pleased just to trade all the rooks here and press with the minor pieces, given how awesome this outpost on d4 is. Just the dark square control in the endgame would be extremely unpleasant for me, and all my pawns fixed on light squares could be targets for the light squared bishop. So, yeah, I didn't want to trade everything. I did go knight a4, though, and my idea with knight a4 was that at least I keep an eye on b2. And this was actually basically the crux of my counterplay, was the concept that even though I have this isolated pawn on d5, this pawn on b2 is actually kind of weak given my knight on a4. And the issue is that if you ever try to push the b pawn, I have the c3 square for my knight and more counterplay along the c file. And so that's the thing that, black is kind of resting his counterplay on, is actually this counterplay on these c file squares. So again, it's actually not possible to push the pawn right away because I have knight c3 forking queen and rook. But even if there wasn't a fork, once you push the b pawn, the a3 pawn is sensitive. So this is kind of the thing that I think secures me dynamic equality. After knight a4, white played rook takes c8, and I played rook takes c8. And now bishop f5 was played. Very decent move, trying to just trade some pieces and get down to an endgame where he can kind of, play against my weakness on d5. But again, I thought as long as I had pressure on b2, I probably would be okay. After bishop f5, I went rook c7 because I didn't want to take on f5 and allow the queen in the game. But it actually turns out that a better move would have actually been to take on f5, and after queen takes, now go rook c7. And the point is that b2 is actually hanging, so white actually doesn't have much besides actually going back. Note that if you try to play like rook d2 to defend the pawn on b2, now all of a sudden rook c1 check, king h2, and g5 would net a piece. So white does have to be a little bit alert here. So, yeah, so this would have been a little bit better of a continuation than what I did. But I went rook c7, and bishop takes d7 was played. And after rook takes d7, white played queen c2. Queen c2 I'm not a huge fan of because it actually just allows my rook to come back to the c file with tempo. Instead, knight d4 would have been more effective. And the reason for this is you firmly blockade my d-pawn, and the knight on d4 is actually quite, menacing because it can jump to f5 with tempo. Sometimes c6 is a weak square. And the other point is that if I go rook c7, like, I kind of want to do, white now goes rook c1 and is ready to contest on the c file. And again, the endgames where, the heavy pieces come off the board, and white can kind of press against my d-pawners actually gives him decent chances. So this would have been a slightly better continuation. Because after queen c2, I just went rook c7 with tempo, and now I get control of the c file again. White now went queen b3, and I think this was actually his idea with allowing me to go rook c7, as he figured I would have menacing pressure against my d-pawn, and that would be really problematic. But I actually looked deeper here and decided that after rook c4, I wouldn't have any problems. And the point is that rook c4, I just cut off the queen from attacking the d5 pawn, and it's quite active on c4 actually. So I thought that this actually holds my position together, and there isn't another good way to add more pressure to d5. So I actually thought here that I was quite active and could maybe try to play for something here if I very quickly moved my queen and played rook c1. So I actually started to get a little bit optimistic here because I finally have some control on the c file. After rook c4, white went knight d2, challenging my rook, and I went rook c8 back. And then white played knight f3, and this was almost like a tacit draw offer because, it's quite clear that he didn't, see a reasonable way to improve his position. But I was quite frustrated that he was, just going to repeat moves here. So I actually went rook c4 again, and then after knight d2, I actually played rook c5. And my idea was like, hey, I don't want to draw. I want to keep playing. I finally feel like I've gotten into the game a little bit, and b2 is still a little bit sensitive. So I thought if I get my queen over there, or maybe if I infiltrate on the c file, I get some counterplay. So after rook c5, white actually went knight f3 back. And you can see in this version, the d-pawn is actually already well protected. So I actually don't have to defend it anymore, and I can switch gears. I decided to do that by playing the move queen c7. And my idea with queen c7 is that even though the d5 pawn is now a little bit loose, it's actually immune from capture, so I thought. Because if you play knight takes d5, I actually go knight takes, rook takes, And then I thought rook c1 check is actually quite dangerous because my queen is covering the h2 square, so the king can't run away. Obviously, the knight can't go to e1. So rook d1 would kind of be forced here. But now I actually thought this move queen c4 would actually be extremely dangerous for white. Point being that if you play queen takes d4, I go rook takes d1, and after queen f1, I take on f1, and then knight takes b2. And in this position, because I have the outside pass pawn, my a pawn might be a little bit dangerous, and I'm automatically threatening knight c4, which threatens to get at the a pawn. So I thought this position would be kind of dangerous for white. So I thought this was actually a really nice try to play for the win, this queen c7 move, because it gave me time to now entertain rook c1 or rook c2 and get that pressure on b2. Again, I'm perfectly happy trading the d pawn for the b2 pawn if I have the outside passer. So after queen c7, white actually went knight d4 now, and I actually kind of underestimated this move. It's quite effective because it actually takes away my infiltration on the c2 square, and it kind of just slows me down a little bit. I now went rook c1, trying to, essentially trade the d1 rooks and secure the b2 pawn. I thought, you know what, I'm actually getting somewhere here, because if rook takes c1, queen takes c1 check, king h2, now after queen takes b2, I'm actually just winning a pawn. Or actually, well, yeah, I am winning a pawn, because after knight takes d5, I wouldn't take on b3 because there's knight f6 check, but I can actually go queen takes f2 now, and I'm actually just a pawn up with a better position. So white has to be very, very alert here because rook takes c1 just doesn't work. And I thought that, if rook takes c1 doesn't work, I'm actually just threatening rook takes d1 and knight takes b2. So I thought I'm really getting somewhere. But now white played a move fairly quickly that I actually just missed, unfortunately, and it was the move knight d3. And for some reason, I just, it's sometimes tricky with knights that they can go backward and you miss some of these details. But the knight on d3 is just the perfect square because it covers the pawn on b2 and it challenges my rook on c1. And so I just can't entertain any more legitimate pressure here. And again, if the rooks come off the board and white hasn't lost any material, he is structurally better. So I decided, you know what, I shouldn't trade my rooks here, and went for the move rook c4. But now, actually, this move actually came with a draw offer, and white actually accepted. And the reason I offered a draw here is because there isn't any legitimate way I can improve. White could go knight f4 back, and we could have the same type of position with rook c1 and just repeat. And otherwise, I actually thought now that the knight is on d3, I have to be really, really careful not to be worse, because white can try to improve his position, maybe going like queen a2 and b3 or something along those lines. Actually, queen a2 would be terrible, because if you play b3, then I have knight c3. But the point is that it's not so simple anymore, and I'm certainly not better. Another way I could have played instead of rook c1 is actually the move rook c4. But the point is that after knight d3 and knight e4, white can just play knight b4. And this is kind of the thing that I'm talking about, the knight on d3, is all of a sudden it can wheel around and attack a lot of important pawns. And this is just a really, really tricky position to play all of a sudden. Now, it turns out that I actually have a draw here. I can play knight c5, hitting the queen on b3 and also protecting the pawn on a6. And after queen a2, because the queen actually is lacking squares, I actually have knight takes f2, which, funnily enough, is a line that looks more dangerous than it actually is, because after king takes f2, I have to go queen h2 to prevent the king from coming back. And after knight f3, knight e4 check, king f1, knight g3 check, we actually can repeat in this way, because the king can't go to e1, because then g2 would hang. So essentially, in this position, after rook c4, there just isn't really much for me to play for here, and structurally I am worse, so there's just no reason to really push the envelope here, and we agreed to a draw. Kind of an annoying game, though. I didn't really get any concrete winning chances, and that's actually what I wanted. But I think that's kind of the nature of playing this position if I play that c5 break and willingly get the Isolani. I need to try and play without the c5 move if I want to, get a dynamic position. And unfortunately, things just fizzled out here. It happens from time to time. It is what it is. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.